Namaskar, friends, and once again, welcome to lecture number 19. In the last class, we talked about some of the critical theoretical propositions by Edward Said, but I believe his concept of Orientalism is so important and so powerful to be missed. I believe we need to pay more attention, more closer attention to this. And with the same in view, I have decided to devote this particular class exclusively to our discussion on Orientalism. Orientalism was one of the most powerful treatises that came in 1978 by Edward Said, and is considered one of the authoritative understandings of post colonial literature and thought process. So, let's talk about it. As I said, this concept is introduced by Edward Said in his book of the same name, Orientalism, which was published in 1978. And basically, this refers to a study as how the Orient um, in East is viewed, stereotyped, and thereby dominated by the Occident, the West. So, how the Western academia and the Western thought process has created Orient uh, as an inferior other and as a binary to the Occident, that is the West, is the idea that is contained in this treatise. And Edward Said, says that the Orient was almost a European invention. So he believes that the Orient that they talk about uh, never existed or does not exist. It is the Orient that has been created through Western imagination. So, if we look at it, it has far reaching influence um, in several disciplines. If we talk about it as an academic discipline, we can say that it refers to scholarly study of Eastern societies and cultures, especially by Western academics, um, their language, their history, religion, and literature. But one thing we got to remember is that this study by the Western scholars is colored in their own imagination and has been informed by their own ulterior motives, and that is why it is not neutral or objective. So, as an academic discipline, we can view it as a discriminatory, representation of the society and culture and literature of the East. As a style of thought, if we talk about it, we can treat it as a way of thinking that divides the world into binary opposites: the West, uh, conceived as Occident, and East, conceived as Orient, in which all the positive values are attached with the West, while all the negatives are the characteristic features of the East. For example, West has been conceived as rational, moral, developed, superior. On the other hand, East is looked at as irrational, exotic, backward, and dangerous. So, we find that the West or the Occident, with its traditional colonization and new imperialism, has established its control through multinational corporations, international monetary structures, and some other forms of foreign aid. So, it continues to be there, although we proudly announce that we are living in a post colonial world. And that is why time and again you got to ask whether post colonialism also means decolonization, or complete decolonization, or complete break from the colonial rules or colonial ideological formations. So, when we look at Orientalism, it sheds light on the underlying structures of power, knowledge, hegemony, culture, and imperialism that have been historically embedded in what Said has called colonial discourse, a discourse that presents the Orient as the other, as I said. So, according to Said, Orientalism is a, and I quote, systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post Enlightenment period. So, Orientalism is a built in system or method by which the West not only socially constructed and actually produced the Orient, but controlled and managed it through a hegemony of power relations, working through the tropes, images, and representations of literature, art, visual media, film, and travel writing, among other aspects of cultural and political appropriation. So, when we talk about this, we also find that Orient was a formation by the West, and it acted as a political instrument through which they justified their imperialism and colonization, and also the East, in their view, was projected as incapable of self governance. So, friends, if you recall, the Britishers were always opposed to granting freedom to India, because they always said that the Indians are not yet mature uh, or capable of, you know, governing themselves. So, this country will suffer chaos if they leave, and that was because they wanted to continue. So, Orient, in fact, did not exist, as I said, in reality, but it was constructed uh, by the Western scholars and Western power structures, um, because, you know, they wanted to keep us under their rule for all the time, and so they constructed us as homogenized, and all the colonial cultures were uh, treated as monolithic structures, forgetting about their diversity and inherent, contradictions. They were also projected as timeless, as if they have frozen in time and they are not developing or progressing like the rest of the world. Uh, the cultures of the East or the Orient were also eroticized or exoticized, in that frequently our cultures were sexualized and romanticized in art and literature of the time. We also found that the Orient was pathologized, in the sense it was associated with irrationality, violence, despotism, and decadence. So, and as a discourse also, if we look at this body of writing that was focused on Orient, it produced knowledge about the Orient that supported and justified Western power. So, and it was also institutionalized through university, government agencies, colonial administrative setup, literature, and media. So, we find that this was not something that was based on actual reality, it was something that served the purpose of Western power structure, and that's why Orient was not conceived as it exists, but as it appeared uh, to the Western imagination. So, it can be concluded that knowledge is not neutral, it is intertwined with power. So, when we further look at what Said has to say, he says that the Orient has been conceived as other or the East, while the Occident refers to the West, mainly Britain and France, because of their massive colonial empires from 19th century until the end of World War II, and the USA since the rise of neocolonialism. So, although we believe that the erstwhile colonial nations got freedom under the stress of different kinds of conflicting situations, resulting in that, alongside the sacrifices made by the natives in the form of their stiff resistance to the colonial exploitation, still it still continues in some form or the other, uh, as we are living under neo-colonialism, in which the so-called Western powers continue to propagate the negatives of the Orient rather than talking about its strengths. So thus the East and the West have been historically, culturally and politically defined as binary oppositions. And for instance, in Naipaul's tableau, An Area of Darkness, um, and this is something which is of concern, because Nepal was a diasporic, but India is frequently cited as an example of uh, cosmopolitan Orientalism. So there we find that his vision for that particular moment is also colored in um, you know this concept of Orientalism. His depiction of India often aligns with Western stereotypes of the East as chaotic, backward, or inscrutable, and that is why we find that he did not find any value in Indian culture. Rather, he concentrated on its gory aspects or the negative aspects, and he looked at the darkness or the darker side of Indian culture rather than looking at its spiritual strengths. So, I quote this line from An Area of Darkness, rather, this passage: Indians defecate everywhere, they defecate mostly beside the railway tracks, they defecate, do not regard it as shameful, and are not offended by it. So, this certainly serves the purpose of the Occident being superior, and uh, the Indian people being primitive and uncivilized. Suketu Mehta vividly portrays Mumbai to a Western readership, which is seen as catering to Western expectations of exoticism and chaos. And I quote from his Maximum City: In Bombay, the distance between the rich and the poor is measured in hunger, in the ability to shut out the city's noise, in the thickness of the walls. So again, this certainly uh, fuels the Western imagination and continues the belief or the conviction they have in Eastern culture or Orient. So colonialism and imperialism not only conquered the Orient and its territory, but also its identity, history, culture, landscape, and voice. So we find that we were subjugated, suppressed, exploited, and we did not have a voice of our own, and everything that we had created was brushed aside and was declared as something useless. And our colonial masters took it on themselves to civilize us, to provide us language, to provide us literature. So, Orientalism, if we look at it uh, in academic discipline, is something which always looks down upon the Orient as the inferior other compared to the West. So, Orient is approached systematically as a topic of learning, discovery, and practice. It is a style of thought that functions on contradictions, conflicts, and binary oppositions that are socially constructed between the Orient and the Occident. So, Orient as a corporate institution for cultural and political domination linked to colonialism and imperialism, and they did not talk about Orient just for the sake of bringing it to the notice of the people, rather for justifying their need for governance by them. So, Orientalism is a hegemonic process that has robbed the Orient's true identity, voice, and indigenous culture by substituting it with the Western gaze, incorporated through pictures, perspectives, and perception created by the Occident. So, by gaze, we mean looking steadily or intently on something. So, it subjectifies or objectivize all that is seen in its own image through its own colored lenses and from its own position of power. So, as I said earlier, the Orient is a concept. It's a concept that was developed by the Western academia in order to perpetuate their dominance of the Orient, because through their ideology, through their literature, through their philosophy, they tried to prove to the rest of the world that the Orient is incapable of any self governance, or it did not have anything that is rational or that can be called civilized, and that's why you know it needs the Western protection, and that is why their ruling them is justified. So again, there is a concept called imaginative geography. So there can be a real geography where we can really identify it with an existing landscape, but Orientalism as a practice does not refer to any particular real landscape. Rather, it represents an imaginative geography of the Orient as viewed by the Western scholars, writers, uh, anthropologists, ethnographers, travelers, and traders, missionaries, explorers, adventurers. Narrative and exotic storytelling invoking Foucault's notion of discourse. So, Foucault has theorized discourse as a system of statements within which the world can be known. It is a system by which dominant groups in society constitute the regime of truth by imposing specific knowledge, disciplines, and values upon dominated groups. So we find that the same thing happens. Uh, Orient is, conceived and propagated by the Western academia, and obviously the image that is created is not the real image, but the image that serves the purpose of the Occident. The hegemonic and stereotypical representation of the Orient by the West and the Orientalists themselves function like a discourse that is sedimented and entrenched in written and oral texts. So, European identity, like us, it is homogenized or treated as us us means the Occident, the rulers. European identity, us, is deemed to be superior to all those. So, who are those? They are non European peoples and cultures reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness. So, Orient is an imaginary phenomenon constituted by generations of writers, intellectuals, artists, commentators, and politicians, and is constructed by naturalizing a wide range of assumptions and stereotypes. So, Orientalism depends for its strategy on the positional superiority of the Westerner, which has very close ties to the enabling socio-economic and political institutions. So, they are out and out, making an effort to project Orient in a poor light so that they can justify their superiority over them. So, if we take some examples from The Midnight Children by Salman Rushdie, uh, the narrator describes India as a place where fantasy, unreason, lust grow best in the heat, associating the East's hot climate with irrationality and passion, contrasting it with the West's cold climate linked to reason and control. So, we find how all the negatives are associated with our country and all the positives belong to the West. The novel includes stereotypical images such as fortune tellers, monkeys on leashes, and Maharajas, which align with Western fantasies of India as a mystical and backward land. Characters in the novel reflect colonial attitudes such as Peruvian teacher calling Indians jungly Indians and savages, emphasizing the trope of the primitive native needing civilization by Europeans. So, we easily find that our age old culture, which was so advanced, is completely erased or nullified in this kind of discourse, and we have been, sort of mentioned, or we have been resorted to, you know, um, uncivilized brutes who need civilization. So, there is appropriation of identity and voice. Said reiterates that Orientalism is built by continuous self referentiality to the past works of Western authors rather than containing any references to actual lived reality, therefore, making it a dubious and circular discourse that builds its foundation on words, images, textuality, and preconceptions that have already been prevalent. So, we find that the Western superiority is perpetuated through references to Western literature, and there is no mention of any literature from the glorious past because that does not exist for them, or that has been deliberately erased so that their purpose can be served. The word connotes not only as a set of static notions about the East, it also signifies stereotypical characteristics of the Orient as exotic, static, irrational, remote, barbaric, West modern, barbaric, primitive, and emotional, in binary opposition to characteristics used to describe the West, like West is modern, West is rational, West is civilized, West is advanced, West is scientific. So, self referentiality of Orientalism operates like virtual reality, artificially created through words, pictures, and perspectives that do not reflect the actual reality of the original, but rather gets marginalized and normalized into the cultural discourse of representations of the Orient or the other as something that is inferior. So, in this entire discourse, we find how neatly the world is divided into the bright side, that is Occident, and the dark side, that is the Orient, while the actual is the Occident. The other side is just a shadow, or poor shadow, or dark shadow of the actual. So, Franz Fanon says that history originates from the point of view of the colonizer or the settler. The colonizer sees the colonized territory as being his own land, or as the point at which its history begins, wiping out centuries of prior existence. And that is true when we look at the colonial rule in India. When the Britishers and other colonial powers came to India, they thought that India is a land in wilderness, and they are here as the God sent to put it in order. And in fact, for them, the history of this nation begins with them. So, in Orientalism, this history has been carved by these Western experts, scholars, historians, anthropologists, writers, artists, travelers, or explorers and conquerors and adventurers, pioneers and discoverers, uh, who are themselves white, male, European, and Western, and hail and celebrate history of their European heroes. Hence, the history of the native, the story of the other, is forgotten in modern day imperialism. So, you know, if we go through, the British scholars will find that their Shakespeare's, their Miltons, they are the real heroes, and the reference points, as if our country was not capable of producing any such literary giants. But the fact is, the history is witness that our civilization was much more advanced, and we also had our Kalidasa, Bhartrihari, and so on and so forth, who are in no sense inferior to any of this. So, Eurocentrism is represented through our hailing the sense of superiority and the privilege of the Westerner. Said consistently emphasizes the word us, we, and our to show how we normalize all concepts according to our Western Eurocentric perspective as being universal and normal, and opposed to any other way of seeing. So they were, they were always very proud of their own culture, which they always associated with something enlightening. And they refer to the culture of the colonized people as something that was other, inferior, other. We not only represent but also speak for the other, appropriating and negating the subaltern voice. So, even they were the people who used to talk on our behalf, and that again was another attempt on their part to silence our voices. So, the power to name, who has the power to name? Only a person with authority has power to name, and without name, you don't exist. So, Said poses this question: who has the power to name? Orient, Occident, East, West, binary is profoundly entrenched concept that colors our perceptions, ideas, and representations of the other, and this has been conceived not by any other but by the Occidental powers. So, Said remarks European culture was able to manage and produce the Orient because it always had the authority to and power to name. It happened because traditional silencing of the subaltern voice of the Oriental took place. There was role and power of the language of communication. So basically, even now we talk about English being the global language. So it was the language of those colonial masters, and through this language, they perpetuated the image of the Orient, and they talked about the Orient with some kind of authority and authenticity, so much so that the rest of the world you know started thinking of the Orient the way uh, these representations wanted them to see and realize. So there was politics of location or positionality as well. We always find that somebody who is in position of power is somebody who holds the key or the authority to dictate. So there was also an attempt to feminize the Orient, and all of us know that patriarchal structures have traditionally suppressed and oppressed the feminine. So there was implicit and powerful difference between the Occident and the Orient. The former writes about, whereas the latter is written about and does not have a voice of its own. Orient is presumed with passivity, while Occident assumes the role of power to observe and to study. As Roland Barthes has remarked, myth can invent itself ceaselessly. So, if you propagate some kind of myth about particular people, particular culture, it will continue to invent itself and will continue forever in some form or the other. Said, referring to the works of P.M. Foster, analyzes the motives with which the Orient is represented, that is, weak, feminized, exotic, mysterious, sensual, and sexual, as something to be desired and to be possessed. In this typical form of colonial discourse, the land, the landscape, the country becomes the main character and is appropriated by the Western traveler's gaze. So, this could be observed in Divakaruni's novels such as The Mistress of Spices and Arranged Marriage. Protagonists explore the struggle of Indian immigrant women to assert their own voices and cultural expectations and Western perceptions. Her protagonists often experience a sense of being spoken for by both their families and the dominant culture in their host societies. So I quote Rao, who comments, the complexities of their distinctive identity require particular note as they indicate both the challenges posed by the fragile cultural roots and the possibilities for successful integration in the host community. So Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni's fiction often offers the resolution of this dilemma in the form of an amalgamation of Oriental ethics with the Occidental ethos. So we find that how this concept of Orientalism, Orient being inferior, other is stereotyped, being weak, irrational, uh, you know, uh, ingrained these thoughts in the minds of those Oriental subjects as well, who started believing in all these propositions, and they started inculcating these values in themselves, like they started feeling shameful of their own language, their own culture, their own religion, their own cultural practices, so much so that they also started criticizing their own culture. Such was the power. And this Orientalism, uh, as a concept of otherness, continues to be there as we find our characters struggle in these Western countries, because they are looked at and perpetuated through these Oriental images, we find that getting reflected in foreign policy and war, in class of civilization narratives. We also find it in the post 9 element discourses, in TV series like Aladdin, The Mummy, in video games like Call to Duty, Prince of Persia, Assassin's Creed. So they continue to, perpetuate this kind of exoticization of the Orient in some form or the other. And you know, there is this famous, you know, uh, line by Rudyard Kipling, who says, East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. And it defines the entrenched colonial attitude. Contrarily, Said believes that the East is East and the West is West, but the two are symbiotically intertwined and interdependent. So there has to be a relationship of equals between the two, complementary rather than, treating them as two halves of the world. This ambivalent love hate relationship of the colonizer colonized is discussed later, but the point that Said makes here about mutual support and interdependence of the Orient and Occident is deconstructionist, that the binaries break down reflecting each other. Said argues the West is created by the Orient, that it could not exist without the East. So, if there is no Orient, there is no West either. The values, the achievements, the superiority of the West is perpetuated with reference to the Orient being the other. If the Orient does not exist, the Occident also dies its natural death. So this is also, a concept of colonial discourse which is applied to the close reading of texts, pointing out the tropes of colonialism hidden in their words and perspectives. Apparently, some of the texts look like pro-Orient, uh, but at the deeper level, it is found out that they are also, uh, you know, guilty of the same colonial colored perception of the Orient. So, colonial discourse is the complex use of signs and codes that organize social existence and social reproduction within colonial relationships. It operates as an instrument of power, disintegration, and marginalization of the origin in the writings, art, and texts. And discourse analysis is used to decode and deconstruct the traces and tropes, codes, and symbols to reveal the ideology, bias, and meaning in the colonial texts. So, the critical analysis of the genres of travel writing came to focus, critiqued, and reinterpreted along the lines of colonial discourse and imperial myths, and found out the truth lying beneath it. So, if we look at the entire colonial corpus of literature that has been created by the so called Occident, it projects Orient as the inferior other, as a chaotic, exotic space that needs to be civilized, needs to be controlled, needs to be disciplined. And so there are lot of stereotypes that have been created by the Western academia, so that they can perpetuate, uh, you know their superiority over the colonial subjects. And that is why this is very important to understand this concept of colonialism, um, in the form of Orientalism, because it continues to perpetuate these Oriental stereotypes through Western media, through Western, discourses, and this has also a bearing on the people of this part of the world who are making it to the Western world, because they are easily othered, because they are not understood as who they are, rather they are looked down upon as some people who are belonging to the Orient, which is the inferior other. And that's why they need to be treated differently compared to the so called developed white people. So, friends, thank you very much. We continue this discussion with reference to some other such powerful, you know, theoretical propositions on diasporic discourse in the next class. For now, thank you very much. These are the references. Thank you.